Hello there, folks. My name is Mark Stay. I'm a writer, screenwriter, author, podcaster. I like writing. I like podcasts about writing. So here are my favorite top 10 podcasts that inspire me as a writer. And let's start with Film Stories, which is with Simon Brew. It's a weekly podcast. He tells the tales behind the movies, as you see. So I love Simon. He's one of these guys who just has such a passion for filmmaking, and he will usually every week take two completely separate movies and just talk about how they got into production and all the ups and downs of that. So if you've ever thought about screenwriting, how films ever get made, it's the podcast for you. Every now and then he'll have a special guest on from the world of filmmaking and talk to them about their career, which is just as enlightening as well. Full disclosure, he did put my film on the cover of his magazine as well, which is a wonderful thing to do. The second podcast that inspires me, another weekly podcast, is Script Notes with John August and Craig Mazin. Now, what sets this apart from so many other podcasts about screenwriting is these blokes are still doing it. So John August, you'll probably know from he's worked with Tim Burton, Frankenweenie. He also wrote Go, which is a Doug Liman movie. Craig Mazin is working on The Last of Us at the moment. This, for me, is an education in screenwriting, storytelling. It doesn't just do craft, it does industry stuff as well. They're totally all over it. It is, for me, forget doing any kind of film or screenwriting course, read screenplays, listen to Script Notes. It's kind of all you need to do, really. Another great podcast for writers is The Conversation with Nadine Matheson. Nadine is a UK best-selling thriller author. And again, every week she gets in authors, talks about their path to publication, the ups and downs of being a writer. And again, because she's been doing it herself, she knows what she's talking about. She's really good fun, very, very passionate about it. And as you'll see, someone I've spoken to recently as well. Now, moving a little away from the regular writing podcasts, I'm inspired by podcasts that seemingly have little to do with storytelling, but one of them is You're Wrong About with Sarah Marshall, and she'll often get on a guest and take a subject that you think you know about, and she'll turn it on its head. Now, if you're looking at writing nonfiction, or you want a new take on some old idea, she'll say, you think you knew this, but here's an original take on it, which as a writer is just invaluable, because very often you'll be asked to pitch your idea, your take on something, particularly in screenwriting as well. So if you can just exercise that part of the mind where you're going at it from a slightly different angle. Okay, here's the conventional way that everyone thinks about it, but You're Wrong About says to you, no, actually, think about it this way. It's really, really good. Now, for something completely different, Smersh Pod started out as a podcast going through the James Bond movies and, looking at them from a fan's perspective. It's the product of John Rain, who's very passionate about Bond movies. He's done a book on them as well, and he'll often get a guest in and ask them what their favorite Bond movie is, and they'll basically go through the synopsis of the film and talk about the ups and downs of the movie. He's now branched out. I think he's done Lord of the Rings ones recently. But again, just in terms of looking at structure, in terms of looking at the storytelling, what works and what doesn't, it's really, really good. He gets very, very rude, quite scatological sometimes. Depends on the guests that he gets on. I remember when he had Samira Ahmed on there, he's very well behaved. But when he's got his lads on there, it can get quite sweary. So just be warned. But it's very, very good. Authorized is a fantastic podcast about novelizations of movies, and I love it simply because it takes the movies that we love and looks at how those lucky enough to get a novelization have adapted that movie for the written page. Now, full disclosure, I've been on that podcast as a guest quite a few times, not least talking about Rover Overlords and the novelization of that. But it's really, really good fun. And it's presented by Andrew Overby and Hannah Blackman, who have read hundreds of novelizations, so you don't have to. And it's, but just in terms of translating the screen to the page, it's a real education, and they really, really know their stuff. Someone else who really knows his stuff is Joel Morris. His podcast, Comfort Blanket, has become a regular and essential listen for me. He'll have a guest on there who will talk about something that they're passionate about. Very often, it's a movie, a book, or a TV show or something. Joel Morris also has this brilliant analytical mind. He also did the Rule of Three podcast about comedy, and more recently he's done the book Be Funny or Die, which I've got here, which is like an essential book on writing comedy and how comedy works. There was also a limited run podcast of this too, which is definitely worth checking out. But he has this wonderful analytical mind where he deconstructs stuff and figures out why it works in a way that is really, really engaging. Very often in comedy, you're thinking, no, don't explain the joke. It's usually the worst thing to do. But he explains the joke, but makes you passionate for it. It's really, really good. And again, getting a bit further away from the actual writing here, but I just love this podcast, Rock on Tours with Gary Kemp from Spandau Ballet and Guy Pratt, session bassist who's worked with the likes of Pink Floyd, David Gilmour. They're getting old rockers on telling their stories. Now, what I find really inspiring about this as a writer is how similar the music industry is to the publishing industry and the film industry, all these creative industries, because the underlying thing, the common denominator through all of these things is resilience and a passion for the craft. And they'll talk to these grizzled old rockers, many of whom are in their 70s and 80s now, talking about the reason they're still around doing this kind of stuff is because they love it. They love the process. So if you're starting out as a writer, a screenwriter, whatever, you listen to some of these stories and they are really, really inspiring. Still inspiring, but in a very scary way, is the Scarred for Life podcast. This is based on the Scarred for Life books. There are 3 of these things, really chunky, looking at all the things basically that terrified me as a kid on TV. Like there's threads on the cover, or Doctor Who, all those public information films that they showed at school and absolutely traumatized an entire generation, Generation X, hello there. But with the podcast, they're getting on regular guests talking about the things that scarred them for life. But again, very often they're talking about films, TV shows that you thought that maybe you were the only person who remembered that thing. But also just in terms of inspiration and looking at how far storytelling can go and can really push the boundaries, it's definitely inspirational. And last but by no means least is 50 Years of Shit Robots, which is a podcast from Matt Brown and Stephen Murray, where they've been looking back at the history of robots in film and TV. But again, great analysis. They really know their stuff when it comes to storytelling. They've recently done a whole run on Star Wars, A New Hope, episode 4. Which has been just an absolute joy. Again, full disclosure, I've been on there to talk about robot overlords as well, but it's a really, really fun podcast, definitely worth checking out. Speaking of checking out podcasts, I used to be on the Bestseller Experiment, which there's over 450 episodes out there now, where myself and Mark DeVoe talk to writers and people in the publishing industry about what makes a bestseller. And we started out by writing our own novel, Back to Reality, which there it is up there, available now. But also I've got like shelves over there full of books of people who listened to the podcast, were inspired by something they heard, went on to finish their book and got published or won awards, or just self-published or whatever. It's checking out the Bestseller Experiment. And I've got a podcast as well, which is Mark Stay's Creative Differences, where I talk to writer friends about the little things that make a big difference to their creative process. And what I do it first as a live stream, and then a few days later it gets polished and edited by Kai and Emily, who are upstairs, into something that is a bit more streamlined. But we just had Dean Matheson on a live stream just a few days ago. That edit is being polished now, should be out in the next couple of days. And I do those one a month, and I really, really enjoy them. So yes, those are the podcasts that inspire me as of April 2025. What are your favorite podcasts? Let me know in the comments below.